There was a small land nestled in the heart of the Mediterranean. It had no mighty rivers like Egypt, no vast, fertile plains stretching across the landscape like Mesopotamia. It never built towering pyramids that left the world in awe, and yet it became the birthplace of Western philosophy, the first democracy, mathematics, science, and ideas that would shape human civilization for more than 2,000 years. That place was ancient Greece. When people think of Greece, most imagine white marble temples beneath brilliant blue skies, statues of Zeus, Athena, and Apollo, and philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle debating the nature of truth. But there is one question that very few people ever stop to ask. If all of those great achievements were only the final result, then where did the story truly begin? Was Greek civilization really created by the Greeks themselves? Or was it the inheritance of an even older civilization? A civilization that vanished from history, but left behind traces in myths, legends, and beneath the earth itself? That question has fueled debate among archaeologists for generations. Because the deeper they excavated beneath the soil and stone of the Aegean world, the more they realized that the story of Greece did not begin with Athens. It did not begin with Sparta. It did not even begin with the gods of Mount Olympus. It began on an island in the middle of the sea, an island that was once the center of a brilliant civilization before suddenly disappearing into darkness. Crete. Around 3000 BC, while much of Europe was still in its earliest stages of development, an extraordinary society had already emerged on the island of Crete. Today, archaeologists call it the Minoan civilization. The Minoans built vast palace complexes with corridors, staircases, storage rooms, and sophisticated administrative systems. They traded by sea with Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Near East, while leaving behind remarkable frescoes, exquisite jewelry, and a writing system that has still not been fully deciphered. What is truly astonishing is that, while many ancient civilizations surrounded their cities with massive defensive walls to protect themselves from war, the major Minoan centers appear to have lacked comparable fortifications. That has led many researchers to propose an intriguing theory. What if their true strength did not lie in their armies, but in the sea itself? Crete sat at the crossroads of the Mediterranean's maritime trade routes. From there, ships could sail south to Egypt, east to Asia Minor, or north toward the lands of Europe. The sea brought more than wealth. It brought knowledge, construction techniques, agricultural methods, religious ideas, innovations from across the ancient world. If the Mediterranean was the heart of the ancient world, then Crete was once one of its strongest heartbeats. But the strange thing is, we know remarkably little about the people who built that civilization. Who were they? What language did they speak? What did they believe? They recorded their story using a writing system that we now call Linear A. Yet after hundreds of years of research, humanity is still unable to read most of those inscriptions. That silence in the written record has left the daily life, beliefs, and social organization of the Minoans shrouded in mystery. Just imagine, what if one day every book, every computer, and every language of the modern world disappeared? 3,000 years later, another civilization discovers our hard drives and our books, but cannot understand a single symbol written inside them. They would know that we once existed, but they would never understand what we thought. That is almost exactly the situation archaeologists face when they stand before the writings of the Minoans. Every symbol is like a door, but the key to unlock it was lost long ago, and perhaps behind those symbols lies the answer to one of history's greatest mysteries. Where did Greece truly begin? If Linear A is ever deciphered, will we discover that Greek civilization was simply the next chapter of a story that began much earlier? Or will every theory we have built over the years completely fall apart? As of today, no one can answer that question with certainty. But while scholars continue searching for answers beneath layer after layer of archaeological remains, nature itself seemed to be preparing an event that would change the entire history of the Aegean world. An event that many believe not only wiped out a civilization, but also planted the seeds of one of the most famous legends of all time, Atlantis. Knossos, the labyrinth of a forgotten civilization. If you could travel back in time to around 3000 BC and stand on a hill overlooking the island of Crete, the first thing that would likely leave you in awe would not be the ships sailing offshore. It would be a colossal structure rising at the heart of the island. Knossos. Today, all that remains of Knossos are weathered stone walls, reconstructed columns, and courtyards marked by the passage of time. But more than 3,000 years ago, it was one of the most powerful centers in the Mediterranean. What astonished archaeologists was not simply its size. It was the way it had been built. Knossos looked unlike any palace the world had ever known. There was no clearly defined central axis, no long, straight corridors, no symmetrical layout like the monuments of Egypt. Instead, there were hundreds of interconnected rooms, staircases leading upward then downward again, twisting passageways, chambers buried deep within the palace, storage rooms, workshops, ceremonial spaces, residences for the elite. Everything was woven together into what seemed like one enormous labyrinth. And that very image led many scholars to ask a fascinating question. Was the legend of King Minos' labyrinth really nothing more than a myth? Or was it born from the memories of people who had once walked through this very palace? According to Greek mythology, beneath the island of Crete lay a vast labyrinth where the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, was imprisoned. Every 9 years, Athens was forced to send young men and women there as sacrifices, until the hero Theseus entered the labyrinth, carrying Princess Ariadne's thread, and slew the Minotaur. For centuries, most people believed it was nothing more than an imaginary tale. But when Knossos was excavated in the late 19th century, many began to reconsider. Seen from above, the entire palace closely resembles a gigantic maze. Hundreds of rooms connected one after another, twisting corridors that could easily leave a first-time visitor hopelessly disoriented. Perhaps the legend was not entirely a product of imagination. Perhaps it was simply a memory that had been transformed into mythology through thousands of years of storytelling. That is something history has shown us time and again. A real event, a real place, a real person. After being retold for centuries, it eventually becomes legend. But Knossos holds even more mysteries than that. The palace walls are covered with vibrant frescoes, not scenes of war, not conquering armies, but festivals, dances, dolphins leaping through the sea, flowers, young women dressed in layered skirts, young men performing the daring ritual of vaulting over the backs of bulls. It is a world overflowing with life, a civilization that seems to have cherished beauty more than violence. This stands in striking contrast to the later Mycenaean civilization, where massive fortification walls, warriors, and weapons became the symbols of power. Did the Minoans truly live through an unusually peaceful era, or have the traces of their wars simply not yet been found? Even today, archaeologists still cannot offer a definitive answer. One of the most astonishing discoveries at Knossos was hidden inside what appeared to be ordinary rooms. Its storage chambers, hundreds of enormous clay jars stood in long rows, some nearly as tall as a grown adult. They once held olive oil, wine, grain, honey, spices, and many other valuable goods. This tells us that Knossos was far more than the residence of a king. It functioned as the administrative center of Crete's entire economy. Every harvest, every tribute, every commercial transaction was managed from this place. To oversee such a vast system, they needed records, and that is where the mysterious clay tablets appeared. Archaeologists call this writing system Linear A. Thousands of inscriptions have been discovered, carefully carved into clay tablets. They appear to record goods, inventories, accounts, or perhaps religious ceremonies. But that remains only a theory, because even today, no one in the world can read them. It remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Just imagine, what if tomorrow humanity discovered a room filled with the writings of Leonardo da Vinci, but no one could understand the language he had written them in? How would we feel? That is exactly how archaeologists feel every time they look at the Minoan clay tablets. Those inscriptions are undoubtedly telling a story, but that story remains completely silent. Even more intriguing, a few centuries later, another writing system appeared on mainland Greece. Researchers call it Linear B. Unlike Linear A, this script was eventually deciphered and identified as the earliest known form of the Greek language. That discovery revealed that Greek civilization developed through successive historical layers rather than appearing suddenly. That finding gave rise to yet another theory. Did the Mycenaeans learn administration, record-keeping, and social organization from the Minoans? Or did they simply inherit what remained after a great civilization had fallen? If that is true, then ancient Greece was not the beginning. It was merely the next chapter in a story that had begun long before. But history rarely unfolds in peace. Just as the Minoan civilization was reaching the height of its glory, nature began to make its voice heard. North of Crete, a small island was quietly gathering unimaginable power. No one knew that before long, a volcanic eruption would shake the entire Aegean world. Columns of ash would darken the sky. Towering waves would crash against the shores, and the fate of the Minoan civilization would be changed forever. The catastrophe was called Santorini. The day the sky turned to darkness. Human history is often written by kings, by wars, by empires. But sometimes, all it takes is for a volcano to awaken, and everything can disappear. No army is powerful enough to stand against the ocean. No fortress wall is high enough to stop columns of ash rising for miles into the sky. And no civilization can truly prepare for what is about to happen. Sometime between 1600 and 1500 BC, beneath the island of Thera, known today as Santorini, the earth began to tremble. At first, the earthquakes were small, but the pressure beneath the earth's crust continued to build until the entire volcano erupted in one of the most violent volcanic explosions humanity has ever known. Try to imagine that moment. An ordinary morning on the island of Crete. Ships are preparing to leave the harbor. Merchants are inspecting their cargo. Craftsmen are hard at work in their pottery workshops. Children are running across the wide courtyards of Knossos. No one realizes that, on the distant horizon, a mountain is about to tear the sky apart. Then, in an instant, the ground begins to shake. A deafening explosion echoes across the sea. Louder than any thunder humanity had ever heard, an enormous cloud of smoke and ash rises so high that it blocks out the sun. Volcanic ash begins to fall into the sea, onto the fields, onto the cities. The daylight sky slowly turns dark gray. Perhaps, for the people living at that moment, they truly believed the end of the world had arrived. According to the original account, after the eruption, towering columns of ash covered the sky, while tsunamis reaching dozens of meters in height crashed into nearby islands and coastlines. Many scientists believe this catastrophe severely weakened the Minoan civilization, paving the way for the Mycenaeans to rise to dominance in the region. However, others argue that the volcanic eruption alone would not have been enough to bring down such a powerful civilization so quickly. That is where history begins to grow more complicated. If the eruption was truly that devastating, why did Knossos continue to exist for some time afterward? If the tsunami wiped everything away, why do traces of Minoan civilization continue to appear? These questions have led many scholars to suggest Santorini was not the final blow. It was only the first. A blow that stripped the civilization that once ruled the Mediterranean of the strength it had long depended on. Imagine a modern nation, its ports destroyed, its trade routes severed, its harvests failing, earthquakes striking again and again, its economy collapsing. Even without war, that nation would descend into crisis. Perhaps that is exactly what happened to the Minoans, because their greatest strength was never their farmland, nor their military, it was the sea. If the sea was no longer safe, if ships could no longer reach their harbors, if trade routes were disrupted, then their entire economy would begin to unravel. That is why many researchers today believe the natural disaster was only the beginning. It may have been followed by years of earthquakes, perhaps famine, perhaps social unrest, or even attacks from outside forces. The original account also emphasizes that beyond the volcanic eruption, scholars have proposed other possible causes, including earthquakes, warfare, or prolonged climate change, but there is still no definitive evidence identifying the single, decisive factor. The most frightening thing about history is not always what we know, it is what we do not know. The empty spaces, the gaps that make every theory seem plausible, and it was from those very gaps that another civilization began to emerge. As Crete gradually declined, on mainland Greece, cities surrounded by massive stone walls continued to grow. These were the Mycenaeans. Unlike the Minoans, they became known for their formidable fortresses, powerful warriors, and a culture with a distinctly military character. Their immense stone walls were so enormous that later Greeks believed only the mythical Cyclopes could have built them. They also used the Linear B writing system, the earliest known form of written Greek to be successfully deciphered. The contrast between these two civilizations is remarkable. One belonged to the sea, the other to the mainland. One was built on trade, the other on war. One filled its walls with colorful frescoes, the other surrounded itself with stone fortresses. History seemed to be changing direction. Did the Mycenaeans conquer a civilization that had already been weakened, or did they simply step into the void that nature had created? No one can say for certain, but one thing is almost undeniable. After Santorini, the Mediterranean was no longer the same world. A new order was taking shape. And then, many centuries later, a philosopher named Plato would tell the story of a wealthy and powerful island, home to an extraordinary civilization that vanished beneath the sea in a single day and night. That story was called Atlantis. Was it merely a moral allegory? Or did Plato unknowingly preserve the last surviving memory of a civilization that had once truly existed? Atlantis, a city lost beneath the sea, or the last memory of a lost civilization? History has a strange way of working. Sometimes, what people cannot explain becomes mythology. What no longer has evidence becomes legend. And over time, the line between fact and imagination slowly disappears. Perhaps no story illustrates that better than Atlantis. Even today, the moment people hear that name, they immediately picture a legendary city, a wealthy island, a civilization far ahead of its time, magnificent palaces, massive harbors, engineering feats that would astonish even the modern world. And then, in a single day and a single night, everything vanished beneath the sea, leaving no trace behind. For centuries, Atlantis has inspired countless books, films, and endless debates, but few people remember that the first person to tell the story of Atlantis was not an archaeologist, not a historian, but a philosopher. His name was Plato. Around the 4th century BC, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, Plato described a mighty island located beyond the Pillars of Heracles. According to his account, Atlantis was home to an extraordinarily advanced civilization, but in the end it was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night as punishment for human arrogance. Ever since, the story has become one of history's greatest mysteries. For centuries, most scholars regarded it as a philosophical tale, an allegory, a warning that any civilization can collapse if it loses its morality and humility. Had the story ended there, Atlantis might have remained nothing more than a beautiful legend. But then, archaeology entered the conversation. In the early 20th century, excavations on the island of Crete, the discoveries at Knossos, the remains of the Minoan civilization, and especially the evidence of Santorini's massive volcanic eruption, all led many researchers to ask an entirely new question. What if Plato was not completely inventing the story? What if he was preserving an ancient memory? A memory passed down through generations by word of mouth, a memory of the Minoan civilization. The original account also presents this very hypothesis. Many scholars believe Plato may have drawn inspiration from memories of the Minoan civilization's decline following the Santorini eruption, although no conclusive evidence has ever confirmed that Atlantis itself actually existed. It is an intriguing idea, and indeed, there are remarkable similarities. Both describe a powerful maritime civilization. Both reached an extraordinary level of development. Both disappeared after a catastrophic disaster. Both left behind a gap in history. But this is also where the difficult questions begin. If Atlantis truly was the Minoan civilization, why did Plato place it somewhere different from Crete? Why does his timeline not fully match the archaeological evidence? And perhaps most importantly, why has no Minoan text ever confirmed the story? Perhaps such records once existed, but if they did, they would have been written in Linear A, a script that, even today, humanity still cannot read. That is what makes the Atlantis story so fascinating, because every time science moves one step closer, the mystery seems to retreat one step farther. If one day, Linear A is finally deciphered, will we discover records describing a great flood, a volcanic eruption, or perhaps an entirely different name for the civilization Plato would later call Atlantis? No one knows, and that very silence allows human imagination to flourish more than ever. But perhaps that is also why Atlantis has never died, because a mystery that has been solved becomes history, while a mystery that remains unsolved becomes legend. The truly fascinating part is this. If you look back over everything we have covered in this chapter, you may realize something unexpected. Perhaps Atlantis was never the main character. The Minoans were not the main character either. Not even Santorini. The real main character is the question itself, a question that has followed archaeologists for more than a century. Did Greek civilization truly begin with the Greeks? Or was it built upon the foundations of civilizations that had already disappeared? To this day, no one can answer with certainty. But one thing is clear. After the decline of the Minoans, after the rise of the Mycenaeans, after centuries of upheaval, a new civilization would emerge. One that would not merely transform the Aegean world, but forever change the way humanity thinks about the world itself. There, the gods would rule the heavens, prophecies would shape the fate of kings, legends would become the soul of an entire people, and atop a mountain crowned with white clouds, the Greeks believed the gods were still watching over the destiny of humankind. That is where the next chapter of our story begins. Mount Olympus. When the gods ruled the world, Olympus, where the Greeks believed the gods lived. Imagine this. You are a Greek living around the 8th century BC. Every morning, as you step outside your small stone house, the first thing you see in the distance is not a palace, nor a fortress, but an enormous mountain. Its summit is always hidden beneath white clouds. On some days, sunlight bathes the slopes, while the peak remains completely veiled in thick mist. To modern people, it is simply a weather phenomenon. But to the ancient Greeks, it was a place no ordinary human was meant to set foot upon, because at the summit, the gods were believed to live. That mountain was called Olympus. Today, Mount Olympus is known as the highest mountain in Greece, rising to nearly 3,000 meters. In ancient Greek belief, it was the home of the Olympian gods, completely separate from the world of mortals. Climbing to its summit without divine sanction was once regarded as an act of disrespect toward the gods. But what made Olympus extraordinary was not its height, it was what it represented. In the Greek worldview, the gods did not dwell in some distant heaven. They did not exist only after death. They lived here on Earth, only a few thousand meters above humanity. That created a very different way of seeing the world. The gods were not abstract ideas. They were unimaginably powerful neighbors. They could become angry. They could fall in love. They could grow jealous. They could punish. And they could reward. That is why nearly every important event in a Greek person's life began with a prayer. Before a ship sailed, people prayed to Poseidon. Before a new planting season, they prayed to Demeter. Before a battle, they offered sacrifices to Ares or Athena. Even a marriage, the birth of a child, or the construction of a new home, all required the blessing of the gods. According to the original source, as city-states such as Athens, Sparta, and Corinth grew in power, what united the Greek world was not a single king or a unified empire, but a shared belief in the gods of Mount Olympus. Nearly every major decision was accompanied by sacrifices and prayers. Perhaps, this is what many people today find hardest to imagine. We tend to think of religion as one part of life, but for the Greeks, religion was life. There was no separation between politics and faith, no separation between law and the gods, no separation between war and divine will. If the harvest failed, perhaps the gods were angry. If an earthquake struck, perhaps Poseidon had driven his trident into the earth. If a war was lost, perhaps Athena had turned her back on your city. Everything had an explanation, and that explanation always began with the gods. But the deeper historians have studied this world, the more they have begun asking a very different question. What if the Olympian gods were never gods at all? What if they had once been real people? It sounds like a strange idea, but consider history. In many ancient civilizations, kings were often deified after their deaths. In Egypt, the pharaoh was regarded as the living embodiment of a god. In Rome, some emperors were worshipped as gods after they died. So, could something similar have happened in Greece? The original script also raises this possibility that the gods may not have been literal deities, but exceptionally powerful figures from the distant past, whose stories gradually became mythologized over generations. At the same time, there is no archaeological evidence that a palace of the gods ever stood atop Mount Olympus. This is where history and mythology begin to merge. There is not enough evidence to prove the idea, nor enough evidence to completely dismiss it. That is why Olympus became something greater than a mountain. It became a symbol, the spiritual heart of an entire civilization. But if Olympus was the home of the gods, then the next question is even more fascinating. Who ruled the world? Before Zeus, according to Greek tradition, before Zeus, before Athena, before Apollo, the world belonged to another race, gigantic beings, creatures so powerful that even the gods themselves feared them. They were called the Titans. The War of the Titans. Myth or the memory of a shift in power? If you asked an ancient Greek, who was the very first god to rule the world, you would probably receive a surprising answer. Not Zeus, not Poseidon, nor Hades, because according to them, before the Olympians, the world belonged to another race. Gigantic beings, older, more powerful, and far more terrifying. They were called the Titans. To the ancient Greeks, this was not mythology, it was the history of the universe, a history that began long before humanity itself. According to Greek mythology, before the Olympian gods ruled the world, power belonged to the Titans, led by Kronos. Zeus and his siblings eventually rose up against their father in a 10-year conflict known as the Titanomachy. After their victory, Zeus became the supreme ruler, Poseidon took command of the seas, and Hades became lord of the underworld. To the ancient Greeks, this story explained how order was established in the universe. At first glance, it seems like nothing more than a myth, a war between gods. But there is something remarkable about it. Many ancient civilizations tell strikingly similar stories. In Mesopotamia, a younger generation of gods overthrows the older one. In Canaanite tradition, one generation of deities replaces another. Even in Norse mythology, conflicts between different generations of gods appear again and again. Is that merely a coincidence? Or were people across different cultures trying to preserve the memory of something that had actually happened? Today, some scholars offer a very different interpretation. Perhaps the Titanomachy was never truly a war between gods. Perhaps it was a distant memory of a struggle for power between civilizations or tribes that once lived around the Aegean Sea thousands of years ago. This possibility is also presented in the original source material. Imagine this, 3,000 years ago. A new tribe enters the Greek world. They defeat the people already living there. They establish a new order. Over centuries of oral storytelling, the names of the leaders gradually disappear. The battles become more magnificent. The victors become gods. The defeated become titans. If something like that really happened, then mythology is not fiction. It is simply history told in the language of legend. That is why archaeologists have become increasingly cautious. Whenever they read an ancient myth, they no longer ask, "Did this story really happen?" Instead, they ask, "What is this story trying to remember?" Because in the ancient world, before writing became widespread, people preserved history through songs, through myths, through rituals. Over countless generations, truth and imagination blended together until no one could separate them anymore. That is also why, every time archaeology uncovers a new discovery, an old legend is seen in a completely new light. But the story of Zeus is even more remarkable than that. If Zeus truly defeated Kronos, then he did more than seize power. He reshaped the way the universe itself functioned. The heavens had a ruler, the seas had their guardian, the underworld had its own king. Everything was assigned its rightful place. To the ancient Greeks, that was the moment when chaos ended and order began. At last, humanity could live beneath the protection of the gods. But were those gods truly perfect? Look closely. Zeus is often consumed by anger. Poseidon is quick to seek revenge. Hera burns with jealousy. Ares delights in war. Even Apollo is capable of making mistakes. They are nothing like the all-perfect, all-powerful deities found in many other religions. Instead, they behave very much like human beings. They love, they hate, they struggle for power, they make mistakes, they forgive, they take revenge. Perhaps that is exactly why Greek mythology has endured for more than 2,000 years, because its gods never stood too far above humanity. Instead, they reflected humanity itself, with all its ambition, its pride, its fears, and its flaws. Yet, throughout all of Greek mythology, there is one story even stranger than the War of the Titans. It is the story of a god who dared to defy Zeus, not to seize power, but to give humanity a gift so small, yet one that changed the entire course of human history. The ancient Greeks called that gift fire, and the one who stole it from the gods was Prometheus. Prometheus, the thief of fire or the bringer of civilization? There is a question humanity has asked itself since the dawn of history. What made us human? Not our hands, not our brains, but our ability to master nature. And no symbol represents that more clearly than fire. Today all we have to do is flip a switch. A flame appears. It feels completely ordinary. But imagine going back 3 or 4,000 years, a winter night, no electricity, no gas stove, no heater, in the middle of absolute darkness. The only thing standing between human beings and the cold, wild animals and the night itself was a small fire. If that fire went out, life itself could come to an end. Perhaps that is why nearly every ancient civilization regarded fire as a gift from the gods. And in Greek mythology, there was one god who stole that gift. His name was Prometheus. According to Greek mythology, Prometheus secretly stole fire from the gods on Mount Olympus and brought it down to humanity. Enraged by his defiance, Zeus chained him to a rocky cliff, where each day an eagle descended to devour his liver. Every night, the liver regenerated, condemning Prometheus to an endless cycle of suffering. To the ancient Greeks, the story served as a warning about the consequences of defying the will of the gods. At first glance, it is simply a story of rebellion, one god standing against the supreme ruler of the gods. But look a little deeper. Perhaps Prometheus was never really a story about fire. Perhaps it was a story about knowledge. Imagine this: a prehistoric tribe. For the first time, they learn how to control and preserve fire. They can cook food, forge metal, drive away dangerous animals, live in colder regions. A single discovery, yet one powerful enough to transform the entire course of human history. To the generations that came afterward, that leap forward must have seemed almost impossible to explain. So they told it through a story. Humanity did not discover fire. A god brought fire to humanity. What makes this especially interesting is that the original source presents the very same idea. Some researchers suggest that Prometheus's fire may symbolize a major technological breakthrough, such as metallurgy or the mastery of fire itself, rather than a literal flame. If that is true, then Prometheus was not simply the god of fire. He became the symbol of the first technological revolution, a breakthrough that may have changed the destiny of humankind forever. That is why this story still captivates us after more than 2,000 years. It is not merely about the gods, it is about the price of knowledge. Because in every age, those who bring new knowledge often pay a heavy price. Galileo was put on trial. Socrates was sentenced to death. Many great thinkers were once considered dangerous. Prometheus may have been the very first symbol of that truth. But if Prometheus represents the light of knowledge, Greek mythology also tells a story that stands at the opposite end of the spectrum, a story about the moment every hardship entered the world. That story is called Pandora's Box. According to the legend, after Prometheus stole fire, Zeus decided to create Pandora, the first woman. He gave her a box, or, in some versions of the story, a large jar, with only one condition: never open it. But human beings have always been curious. Pandora opened the container, and in that instant, disease, war, famine, greed, envy, suffering, all escaped into the world, leaving behind only one thing: hope. The ancient Greeks saw this as a lesson about curiosity and the consequences of defying the will of the gods. Along with the stories of Prometheus and Medusa, the tale of Pandora is one of Greek mythology's richest moral allegories. Today, most people remember only the phrase, Pandora's box, a metaphor for consequences that spiral beyond anyone's control. But few notice the final detail: hope. Why did Zeus leave hope behind? Was it an act of mercy, or the greatest punishment of all? Without hope, people would simply give up. But as long as hope remains, they continue to live, they continue to struggle, they continue to endure. It is a question that, even today, philosophers continue to debate. Greek mythology rarely hands us answers. Instead, it asks the questions and leaves humanity to reflect upon them. Perhaps that is why these stories have never truly died. But among all the sacred places of ancient Greece, there was one where mythology was no longer merely a collection of stories. It was a place where people believed the gods themselves spoke. Kings came there before declaring war. Merchants sought its guidance before setting sail. Generals consulted it before deciding the fate of entire nations. That place was called Delphi. And there, a single woman spoke words that would shape Greek history time and time again. The Oracle of Delphi. Pythia. Delphi, where people believed Apollo spoke. There is a question that has followed humanity for thousands of years. If we could know the future, would we be able to change it? Or would the very act of trying to change it be what makes the prophecy come true? For the ancient Greeks, this was not a philosophical question. It was part of everyday life. Before declaring war, before founding a new colony, before passing a new law, or even before choosing an heir. Kings, generals, and wealthy merchants all made the same journey. They crossed mountains, followed winding stone roads, until they reached a place believed to be the center of the world. That place was called Delphi. According to the original source, beginning around the 7th century BC, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi became the place where kings, military leaders, and merchants from across the Greek world sought prophecies before making important decisions. The prophecies were delivered by the oracle Pythia, who was believed to communicate directly with the god Apollo. Today, if you stand among the ruins of Delphi, you will see weathered stone steps, broken columns, ancient foundations that have survived for more than 2,000 years. It is difficult to imagine that this was once a place capable of influencing the fate of entire kingdoms. But to the ancient Greeks, Delphi was more than a temple. It was the place closest to the gods. They believed that Apollo, the god of light, music, knowledge, and prophecy, had chosen this very place to reveal his will. To hear the voice of the god, people had to rely on a single woman. She was known as Pythia. No one knows exactly what she saw. No one knows exactly what she heard. Ancient records simply describe how Pythia sat upon a 3-legged stool, deep within the sacred chamber. After performing rituals of purification, she gradually entered a trance. Then she began to speak, not in long, carefully structured speeches, not in direct answers, but in brief statements, filled with imagery, rich in symbolism, wrapped in ambiguity. And it was that very ambiguity that made Delphi legendary. According to accounts referenced in the original source, Pythia's prophecies were often difficult to understand, but were believed to prove true once events had unfolded. One famous example involves King Croesus of Lydia, who asked whether he should attack the Persian Empire. Pythia replied that if he went to war, a great empire would fall. Croesus believed she meant Persia, but in the end, it was his own kingdom that was destroyed. It is one of history's most famous stories, and also one of its most brilliant prophecies, because regardless of the outcome, the prophecy remained true. It was like a mirror. Everyone who looked into it saw what they wanted to see. Perhaps that was Delphi's greatest power, not the ability to predict the future, but the ability to lead people into making their own decisions, and those decisions would go on to shape the future themselves. But then, modern science began asking a different question. What caused Pythia to enter her trance? Was she truly hearing the voice of Apollo, or was there another explanation? During archaeological investigations, researchers discovered geological fault lines beneath the Temple of Delphi. Some scientists have suggested that in ancient times, ethylene or other naturally occurring gases may have escaped through those cracks. If inhaled in the right concentration, such gases could induce a trance, hallucinations, or altered states of consciousness. This is also one of the hypotheses discussed in the original source. However, the source also emphasizes that many experts remain unconvinced, arguing that there is still insufficient evidence to prove that enough gas was present to produce the effects described in ancient accounts. If that theory is correct, then one of the greatest religious centers of the ancient world may have been built directly above a natural geological phenomenon. But does that truly diminish the significance of Delphi? Perhaps not. Imagine yourself as a Greek living 2,000 years ago. You enter the temple, the scent of incense fills the air, torchlight flickers against the stone walls. The silence is so complete that you can hear nothing but the wind slipping between the columns. Then a woman, lost in a mysterious trance, begins speaking words that no one fully understands. What would you believe? Perhaps you too would believe that the gods were truly present. That is what makes history so fascinating. Science may explain the mechanism, but it cannot replace belief. Because for the ancient Greeks, what mattered was not what kind of gas Pythia may have inhaled. What mattered was their belief that Apollo had chosen her, and it was that belief that influenced decisions which changed the course of history. Even today, no one knows exactly what truly happened inside Delphi's sacred chamber. Was it a natural phenomenon, a remarkably sophisticated form of psychological influence? Or was it genuinely the place where the Greeks believed they were hearing the voice of Apollo? Perhaps we will never know. But it is precisely these mysteries that have made Delphi one of the most enigmatic places of the ancient world. And while the echoes of prophecy still linger among the mountains, elsewhere, Another story was beginning to unfold. A story not about the gods, but about a war. The most beautiful woman in the world, a proud city, and a wooden horse. That story opens the next chapter, the Trojan War. The Trojan War. The truth behind the legend. If there is one war that has crossed the boundary between history and legend to become a symbol of Greek civilization itself, it is undoubtedly the Trojan War. For more than 3,000 years, its story has been retold through poetry, theater, films, and history books. Almost everyone has heard the names Helen of Troy, the warrior Achilles, and the legendary wooden horse. But the more historians study it, the more they arrive at a curious realization. Perhaps the most important question is not who won the war, but rather, did the war ever really happen? Or was it simply an epic passed down through generations of oral tradition until it gradually came to be accepted as history? According to the Iliad, it all began with a woman, Helen, celebrated as the most beautiful woman in the world. When Prince Paris of Troy took her away from Sparta, King Menelaus regarded it as an unforgivable insult. The Greek kings quickly united their forces. Hundreds of warships crossed the sea, and a siege lasting 10 years began. That is the version of the story almost everyone knows. But modern scholars have proposed a very different possibility. Could a massive war involving nearly every Greek city-state truly have been fought over a single woman? Or was Helen a symbolic figure added later, transforming a brutal conflict into a tragic love story? When you look at the map of the ancient world, that theory becomes much more compelling. Troy stood near the Dardanelles Strait, the gateway connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Nearly every merchant ship traveling between those regions had to pass through it. Whoever controlled Troy controlled one of the most important trade routes of the Bronze Age. If that is true, then the real cause of the war may not have been love, but power, gold, trade, economic interests. And just like so many wars throughout human history, love may simply have been the story told afterward. Among all the figures in the epic, none stands taller than Achilles, the warrior who seemed almost impossible to defeat. According to legend, his mother dipped his entire body into the river Styx, making him invulnerable to every weapon. Only his heel remained unprotected because it was the spot where she held him. From that story came the expression, the Achilles heel, a symbol for the fatal weakness hidden within anyone. But then another question arises. Did Achilles ever really exist? To this day, archaeology has uncovered no evidence confirming his existence. Some believe he was entirely mythical. Others suggest Achilles may have been inspired by several renowned Mycenaean warriors whose stories gradually merged into a single legendary hero over generations of storytelling. If that is true, are we reading about one man or about the ideal hero the Greeks wanted to create? On the other side of the battlefield stood Hector, not a god, not an immortal warrior, but a husband, a father, a prince fighting to defend his homeland. What makes this especially remarkable is that, although the Iliad was composed by a Greek poet, Hector is portrayed with courage and dignity equal to that of Achilles. Many modern readers even find themselves sympathizing more with Troy than with the Greeks. Perhaps Homer was never simply celebrating victory. Perhaps he was telling the tragedy of war, a tragedy in which both sides become victims. And then comes the most famous episode of all, the wooden horse. After 10 years of failing to conquer Troy, the Greeks pretended to sail away. They left behind an enormous wooden horse as an offering to the gods. The Trojans brought the gift inside their city. When night fell, the hidden warriors emerged. The city gates were opened, and Troy fell. It remains one of history's most celebrated military strategies. But did the horse ever really exist? Many archaeologists argue that constructing a wooden horse large enough to conceal dozens of soldiers would have been extraordinarily difficult using the technology of that era. As a result, many alternative theories have emerged. Some believe the horse was actually a type of siege engine. Others think it may have been the code name for a military unit. Some scholars have even suggested that the horse symbolized an earthquake. In Greek mythology, Poseidon was not only the god of the sea, he was also the god of earthquakes. And one of Poseidon's symbols was the horse. If an earthquake brought down Troy's walls, later generations could easily have transformed that event into the legend of the wooden horse. No one knows which explanation is correct, and that uncertainty only makes the story even more fascinating. For centuries, many believed Troy itself was nothing more than a product of imagination. Then, in 1870, the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann began excavating a hill called Hisarlik in what is now Turkey. What he uncovered astonished the world. Beneath the earth lay multiple cities, built one atop another over thousands of years. One of those layers showed clear evidence of destruction by war. For the first time, Troy was no longer merely a legend, it became a real archaeological site. But even that did not solve the greatest mystery. Was this truly the Troy Homer described? Or simply another city that happened to meet a similar fate? Even Homer himself, the man traditionally credited with writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, remains an enduring mystery. Did he actually exist? Or was Homer simply the name given to generations of oral storytellers? Perhaps we will never know. But it is precisely because so many questions remain unanswered that the story of Troy continues to be told more than 3,000 years later. And while the heroes gradually passed into legend, elsewhere in Greece, an even greater revolution was quietly beginning. It would no longer be a war fought with swords and spears, but a battle of ideas, an age in which figures such as Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Archimedes would forever change the way humanity understands the world. The minds that changed the world, and the lost knowledge that may be gone forever. As the great wars gradually faded into the past, Greece entered an entirely new chapter. If its history had once been written by swords, fortresses, and legendary heroes, then, between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, another revolution began. This time, the weapon was no longer the spear, it was thought itself. What astonishes historians isn't that Greece once possessed powerful armies. It's that such a small land, divided into dozens of independent city-states that frequently fought one another, could produce so many extraordinary minds within the same period of history. Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Archimedes. Those 5 names alone laid the foundations of mathematics, philosophy, science, and Western thought for more than 2,000 years. Was that simply one of history's rare coincidences? Or did the Greeks inherit a body of knowledge far older than their own civilization? That question still has no definitive answer. One of the most mysterious figures is Pythagoras. Today, most people know him because of the theorem that bears his name. But mathematics was only a small part of this remarkable man's world. According to many ancient accounts, before becoming a renowned philosopher, Pythagoras spent years traveling through Egypt, Babylon, and possibly the Near East, learning from local priests and scholars. If those accounts are true, then he wasn't merely a mathematician. He was someone who brought the accumulated knowledge of multiple civilizations back to Greece. After settling in southern Italy, Pythagoras founded a unique community. Its members lived together. They followed strict rules, and they were forbidden from revealing what they had learned. To some, it resembled a school. To others, it looked much more like a secret society. That secrecy has shrouded Pythagoras' life in countless legends. It was said that he believed everything in the universe could be explained through numbers, music, astronomy, geometry, even the human soul. All of them, he believed, followed an invisible harmony, that mathematics was the language capable of revealing. Today, many of those ideas no longer seem unusual, but more than 2,000 years ago, they represented an entirely new way of understanding the world. So where did those ideas truly come from? Did they originate with Pythagoras himself, or was he simply the first person to organize knowledge that had already existed in places like Egypt and Mesopotamia? No one can say for certain. After Pythagoras, Athens gradually became the intellectual center of Greece, and it was there that a man emerged with an approach unlike that of any philosopher before him. He didn't begin with answers. He began with questions. His name was Socrates. While most philosophers tried to prove themselves right, Socrates constantly challenged everything people assumed to be obvious. He believed that true wisdom begins when we have the courage to admit the limits of our own understanding. His conversations usually took place in the streets of Athens. No lecture halls, no textbooks, no political power, only one question leading to another. And that very method would become the foundation of Western philosophy. Yet those same questions also made him a threat in the eyes of many. In 399 BC, Socrates was brought to trial. He was accused of corrupting the youth and showing disrespect toward the gods of Athens. The final verdict was death by poison. To this day, historians still debate the reason behind his conviction. Was Socrates truly condemned because of his philosophy? Or was the trial simply a political act during one of Athens' most turbulent periods? Perhaps history will never give us a final answer. Socrates' most famous student was Plato. After his teacher's death, Plato founded the Academy of Athens, one of the oldest educational institutions of the ancient world. In his writings, he explored not only the ideal state and the nature of knowledge, he also told the story of a mysterious island called Atlantis. According to Plato, it was an extraordinarily powerful civilization, rich, advanced, prosperous. Then, in the span of a single day and night, the entire island vanished beneath the sea. More than 2,000 years have passed. Atlantis remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Was it merely an allegory warning against human arrogance? Or was Plato preserving the distant memory of the disaster that may have struck the Minoan civilization after the eruption of Santorini? No one knows. Yet that single story has inspired thousands of expeditions over the centuries. If Plato expanded the world of ideas, Aristotle carried knowledge into an even broader realm. He studied nearly every field that people of his time could observe: biology, animals, astronomy, logic, politics, ethics. What made Aristotle remarkable was that he didn't rely on reasoning alone. He observed, he recorded, he compared, he classified. That method may seem ordinary today, but in his time, it represented an extraordinary leap forward. Aristotle also became the teacher of Alexander the Great, the man who would spread Greek culture across a vast empire unlike anything the world had seen before. In many ways, one conquered through ideas, the other conquered through armies. Two different paths, yet both helped reshape the course of world history. The final towering figure of this remarkable era was Archimedes, a mathematician, an engineer, and one of the greatest minds of the ancient world. The principles he discovered are still taught today. Yet what fascinates people even more are the stories surrounding him. According to tradition, during the defense of Syracuse, Archimedes designed ingenious war machines that repeatedly thwarted the Roman army. There is even a famous legend claiming that he used enormous mirrors to concentrate sunlight and set enemy ships ablaze from great distances. To this day, scientists remain divided over whether such a feat was truly possible or merely an exaggeration created by later generations. But like so many stories from ancient Greece, the line between history and legend remains remarkably thin. What is perhaps even more tragic is that many of the works written by Greek scholars have not survived. War, fire, time. Together, they swept away countless manuscripts that humanity may never have the chance to read. Most notably, after the repeated destruction of the Library of Alexandria, no one knows exactly how many scientific works disappeared along with its vast shelves. Some believe those lost books may have contained ideas centuries ahead of their time. Others argue that this is simply a romantic myth created by later generations. But whatever the truth may be, one thing has never changed. Ancient Greece did not leave humanity only with theorems, philosophies, or magnificent architecture. It also left behind mysteries. And sometimes, those mysteries are what keep people searching for more than 2,000 years. Because the most fascinating part of history is not what we already know. It is what seems to have vanished, yet may still be waiting quietly to be discovered one day. Perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient Greece is not the marble temples that have stood for thousands of years, nor is it the breathtaking marble statues, the legendary military victories, or the vast empire once forged by Alexander the Great. Its greatest legacy is the way it changed how humanity sees the world. For the first time in history, people began asking questions not only about the gods, but also about themselves. How was the world created? What is justice? What is truth? Does knowledge have limits? And can human reason truly understand the entire universe? More than 2,000 years have passed. Yet those questions have never grown old. In fact, many of them remain unanswered. We still don't know exactly what caused the collapse of the Minoan civilization. Atlantis continues to exist somewhere between history and legend. The Trojan War still contains gaps that archaeology has yet to fill. Homer's true identity remains a mystery, and countless works of Greek knowledge may have been lost forever in libraries destroyed by war and the passage of time. Perhaps one day, new archaeological discoveries will provide the answers. Or perhaps, some secrets will remain buried forever beneath the earth. beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, or survive only in ancient poems and timeless legends. But perhaps that is precisely why the civilization of ancient Greece has never truly disappeared. Because a civilization only truly dies when no one remembers it anymore. Ancient Greece is still present in the mathematical formulas we use every day, in the scientific principles that continue to transform our world, in the philosophical ideas still taught in universities, in art, architecture, literature, and even in the democratic systems of many modern nations. Whether we realize it or not, we are all still living in the long shadow cast by that civilization. And perhaps that is Greece's greatest legacy. Not what survived in stone, but the ideas that remain alive, ideas that outlived time, survived wars, endured the fall of empires, and continue to shape the world we live in today. Who knows? Thousands of years from now, future generations may look back at our own civilization the same way we look at ancient Greece today. They may ask themselves, how much of history was true? How much has been forgotten? And how many secrets are still waiting to be uncovered? Perhaps that is the greatest beauty of history. Not because it always gives us answers, but because it leaves behind just enough unanswered questions to ensure that human curiosity never stops searching. If you enjoy stories about lost civilizations, archaeological mysteries, discoveries that reshape our understanding of history, and questions that science still cannot answer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us on our future journeys of discovery. Because out there, countless civilizations, countless legends, and countless secrets of humanity are still waiting for us to open the door and explore them together.